She was 31 years old and 11 weeks behind on wages she had already earned. The drawing office laughed at the word copyist. She had no savings, no character reference, and no place in the works her father had helped to build. What she carried out through the gate was a pair of brass dividers, one point worn short from sharpening, that had belonged to Isaac Crane. Instead of the 22 pounds owed to her, Ada Crane was handed a ring of keys to the low furnace ironworks, a dead yard by the railway sidings carrying 400 pounds of debt, and a creditor's sale 7 days out. But what Gideon Wycliffe did not know was that inside the narrow brick tower listed on the settlement schedule as an empty coal store, something from the last working day had never been emptied, and when it moved that night, it would not only change what Ada Crane was worth, it would change whose name went on the railway drawings for the whole valley. The dismissal took about 4 minutes. Gideon Wycliffe stood at the end of the long drawing table on the 8th of February, 1878, with 2 clerks and a foreman in the room, and said that Wycliffe and Crane Engineering had no further use for a woman who copied other men's work in a neat hand. The railway order was safe with him, he said, and always had been. Then he set the keys down, told her the low furnace works were hers in settlement, and mentioned, without any change of voice, that the creditors would sell the place on the 15th. She walked the 2 miles down into the lower Don Valley and let herself in at dusk. The casting pit was full to within a foot of the floor. The great drop hammer sat where it belonged, face down flat on the anvil block, 700 weight of iron with nothing in the building to lift it. She checked the boiler gauge out of habit, and the needle sat at 0. She checked the 4 drive belts and found every one of them cut through at the lacing. She slept in the pattern loft on a bench under her coat, because the room she rented was paid only to the Saturday. Sometime after 2 in the morning, she heard a sound from the forge hall below. It was one hard metallic click, the kind a pawl makes when it drops into a tooth. She came down the ladder with the lamp, stood at the edge of the hammer bay, and held the light up. And the face of the hammer was no longer on the anvil. It stood clear of it. She measured the gap at the near corner, and again at the far corner, and both times it read 6 inches. If you have ever been told that the work you did belonged to somebody else, put it in the comments. I would like to know who is listening tonight. Ada Crane had been raised in a pattern loft, and she trusted a measured line further than she had ever trusted a spoken promise. Her father, Isaac Crane, went into partnership with Gideon Wycliffe in 1868 and had her at the bench before she was 10. By 26, she was doing valve and cylinder work in the drawing office at 22 shillings a week, while men who could not read a section drawing took 34. The week she turned 15, her father gave her a pair of brass dividers in a wooden case and said one thing about them that she still repeated to herself in bad weeks. A drawing is a promise you can check. He died in November of 1876, and after that, Gideon had a word he used whenever anybody asked why the office let a woman near the board. Copyist. He said it kindly, in front of people, the way you would explain a pet. The worst of it was that the word had worked its way inside her, and she had begun to wonder whether the changes she made to her father's ideas were improvements at all, or only tidying. She read the settlement schedule the next morning sitting on an upturned crate. The debts came to 406 pounds, 11 shillings. 82 to a coke merchant, 94 to a steel supplier, 61 in wages to 11 men with her own name among them, and the rest a loan booked against the property in a hand she did not recognize. The last page listed what the creditors meant to sell. Near the bottom was a line she read twice. Brick tower, narrow, east side of yard. Empty coal store, no value. She spent that day making the place safe, because a raised hammer with no power on it is a thing waiting to come down. She cut 2 lengths of oak from the pattern timber, 6 inches by 6, drove them under the hammer face on either side of the anvil, and wedged them. Then she went in under the frame with the lamp. On the near side of the hammer standard was a cylinder she had never seen in any drawing of that hammer, about 5 inches in the bore, its rod running up to a crosshead on the tup guides. She put a can under its drain cock and opened it a quarter turn. Water came out, a short, hard spurt of black water that knocked the can over, then a run, then nothing. She sat back on her heels in the wet and looked at that little cylinder for a long time. Steam had not lifted the hammer because there was no fire, no pressure, and no belt. Water had lifted it, water pushed by something, 6 days after the work stopped. She wrote it in the back of her notebook with the date, the time, and the 6 inches, then went out to see what else she owned. The 9-inch center lathe was good. One hearth had a cracked back, and the other had been robbed of its 2-year iron. 14 slates were gone from the machine shop roof. The overhead crane ran, and she was glad about the crane. She was in the loft counting patterns when she heard somebody on the wall, and went out with a bar in her hand to find a thin boy halfway over with a roll of chisels in his teeth. Eli Ward was 17 and had been an apprentice in the pattern shop until the works closed on the 2nd of February. 11 men had been paid off in one morning, he said. The belts had been cut by a man Mr. Wycliffe sent, and carts had taken the vices and 2 portable pumps on the 3rd and the 4th. She offered him 8 pence a day in bread and dripping at noon. He was there at 7 the next morning with his mother's mattock over his shoulder. On the 2nd day, a woman in black stood at the gate until Ada came over. Miriam Shaw was 44, a widow whose husband had drowned in the canal at Tinsley in 1871, and she had been wage clerk at Low Furnace for 6 years. Her parcel held the wage book, the receipt book, and a press copy letter book with a cracked spine, carried home on the 2nd of February because a man from the main works had come collecting papers. "They will want these back," Miriam said. "I would rather they wanted them from you." Thomas Bell came the day after and stood in the yard a while before he came in. He was 56, a hydraulic fitter who had lost 2 fingers of his left hand to a press in 1863, and he had fitted pipe at Low Furnace on and off for 4 years. Ada showed him the small cylinder and asked what he made of it. He said it wanted new packing, that the leather in it would be 13 years old if it was a day. Then he said he could not stop, and left. She rebuilt the cracked hearth herself, because it was the fastest thing in that yard that could earn money. She took 60 sound fire bricks out of the robbed hearth, mixed fire clay at 9 pence the bushel, laid the back and sides in 2 days, and had Eli forge a new grate from scrap bar. On the Thursday, she took in 11 broken tools from a carting firm at the top of the lane, drew them out and retempered them, and welded a cracked axle band in the fire. She was paid 11 shillings and 6 pence, and it was the first entry in the receipt book in 4 months. She sold 2 tons of yard scrap at 30 shillings the ton to Nancy Gill, who was 60 and had run a scrap yard since her husband died. With that £3 and the last of her own money, she went to the creditors clerk on the 14th of February, paid £5 on account, took the whole schedule of debt onto herself and asked for a stay of the sale. She got 10 weeks to the 30th of April. It was not mercy. The chairman, Mr. Edward Naylor, 58, said that a dead works fetched more with a roof on it than with the roof off, and that she was welcome to spend her own labor keeping it on until they sold it. Before she left, she asked why the tower was down as an empty coal store. "Because the man who made the inventory found it locked," Naylor said, and was told by the vendor's agent that it held nothing. It was the words vendor's agent that she carried home with her. The small cylinder had a brass maker's plate on the flange, painted over. She cleaned it with paraffin and a rag. Latham and Cowper, Leeds, and under that a job number, LC47. She wrote it in her notebook. "If you have ever suspected that the thing they called empty was the thing they wanted most, keep watching, because what she did next was fetch a rule and start digging up her own floor." The pipe from that cylinder ran down the hammer standard and went into the floor at the edge of the bay. She and Eli took up the flags along the wall, which is heavier work than it sounds, and by the end of the 2nd day, they had 18 feet of trench open with a 2-inch wrought iron pipe in it, screwed and socketed, the socket faces made up hard and painted over. Somebody had buried it to stay. Her theory was a sensible one. The Sheffield Water Works had a main in the lane, and a works could take a supply and use town pressure for small lifting jobs. If a valve had been left cracked open, the main had fed that little cylinder all week. She followed the trench to the yard wall, found the stopcock chamber, opened the valve full, and stood with her hand on the hammer frame to feel it move. Nothing moved. She left it open 40 minutes and heard nothing running in the pipe. The gauge killed the theory that evening. She took the lamp to the little brass gauge screwed into the top of the auxiliary cylinder. It was graduated to 1,000 pounds to the square inch. The town main in that lane gave 40 on a good day. Nobody fits a gauge like that except to a system that carries stored water at great pressure. She sat on the anvil block and thought about where in that yard you could hide a thing tall enough and heavy enough to hold water at 700 pounds to the inch. Then she went out into the dark and stood in front of the narrow brick tower, the one the inventory said was empty. The tower was 22 feet high and 8 feet square, with 1 iron door and no window. The door had a new padlock on an old hasp. She fetched a cold chisel and took the hasp off the frame instead, because she wanted the lock kept whole for anybody who asked to see it later. Inside there was no coal, and there never had been. 2 guide rails ran the full height of the brickwork, and between them a ram of about 10 inches diameter rose out of a cylinder set in a stone base. On top of the ram sat a crosshead, and hung from it was a stack of cast iron rings and dressed stone blocks, the whole weight pressing down on the water underneath. 2 pipes left the base. One went toward the pump house. The other went into the ground toward the hammer bay. Ada had never stood inside one, but she had drawn one. It was a weighted accumulator. The pump filled it, the weights pressed down on the water, and the water waited, holding whatever pressure the weights and the ram gave it until a valve was opened, and it handed that pressure back all at once. It did not forge anything, it only lifted. The hammer still did its work by falling, but a hammer that could be raised to a measured height without a large engine turning all day was a hammer a small works could afford to run. She climbed the ladder and found the ram down to within 4 inches of its bottom stop. On the 2nd of February, it would have stood high and full. 6 days later, a leaking isolation valve had passed the last of that stored water along the buried pipe into the little cylinder under the hammer. Slowly, the way a bad tap fills a bucket overnight, until there was pressure enough to raise 700 weight 6 inches and drop the safety pawl into its first tooth. Then there was nothing left to pass. That was why it had happened once and not since, and why it would not happen again until somebody mended that valve and put water back under those weights on purpose. On the ram cap, wiped clean, was a brass plate. Latham & Cowper, Leeds. Job number LC47. The same order as the cylinder under the hammer. 1 job, 1 buyer. There were bright file marks on that plate, cut through the paint into the brass at 2 corners, where somebody had begun to work the number off and had stopped. 2 of the base flange nuts had been started and left slack. Somebody had been inside that tower within the month and had gone away before finishing. She measured the ram, the guides, the weights, and the pipe runs, and drew all of it to scale that night at the board in the loft, dated the 27th of February, 1878. Then she made her worst mistake of that spring. The temptation was simple. If the accumulator could be charged, the hammer could work. And if the hammer could work, the yard could take real orders instead of 11 shillings worth of broken carting tools. The pump had 1 plunger seized, and it took 4 days to free it, lap the valves, and drive it off the boiler at very low steam. She reduced the load, taking 11 cast iron rings and 2 stone blocks off the stack, so the weights would give her about 1/4 of the pressure the thing was built for. She was careful about everything except the one thing Thomas Bell had told her on his first day, which was that the leather packing in the small cylinder was 13 years old. She charged the accumulator on the 9th of March, with Eli watching from the door. The ram came up slowly, 6 inches, a foot, 16 inches. She eased the control valve open, and the hammer rose off its oak blocks, clean and slow, and for about 4 seconds it was the best thing she had ever seen. Then the old leather let go. The cylinder emptied down the standard in 1 push. The water filled the hammer pit inside a minute and spread into the corner where 11 repaired patterns stood drying, and by the time she had the stop valve shut, the joints in 6 of them had opened. Eli looked at her. She told him to fetch the buckets. They bailed until 9 that night. 4 of the 6 dried and glued up again. 2 went on the fire. She wrote in the notebook that evening in the same hand she used for everything else. 9th March. Charge attempted at 200 pounds to the inch. Cylinder packing failed. Cuz, old leather, known to be old, not renewed before test. Fault mine. Nothing wrong with the plan except the order I did it in. The next morning, she went to Thomas Bell's house and told him on his own step what she had done. He heard her out, laughed once, not unkindly, and said a man he worked for in 1866 had done the same with a press and killed a horse. Then he said he would come and do the packing himself if she bought new leather rather than turning the old over. The leather cost 9 shillings and 4 pence. Thomas drove the packing in 2 hours and made her wait a day for it to bed. He also gave her the rule she wrote at the top of the test page and never broke again. Test in steps. Hold each step 20 minutes. Have somebody who is not you watching the gauge, and have them write down what they see and put their name to it. That was the first time it went through her mind that a measurement nobody had watched her take might be worth less than a measurement somebody else had seen. Miriam Shaw brought the other half of it in a parcel again. She had been working through the press copy letter book at her own table in the evenings. 9 of the work's own outgoing letters, between June 1876 and September 1877, had gone from Low Furnace to the Midland Union Railway Company at Derby, and every one concerned trials of what the letters called the pressure lift at Low Furnace. 3 had replies pinned to them from Joseph Ellison, engineer to the purchasing committee. 1, dated the 4th of August, 1877, thanked Mr. Isaac Crane's Works for the demonstration of the 29th of July and recorded that the hammer had been raised to 19 inches and had struck 11 blows to the minute. Ada opened her own notebook at the 29th of July. 19 inches, 11 blows. The same figures in her own hand, written the same afternoon, because she had been the one standing at the gauge. Miriam laid the rest out on the bench like a hand of cards. The experimental account showed the purchase of Latham and Cowper job number LC47 in June 1876, £68, 10 shillings, paid out of low furnace money. It showed, in October 1877, a railway advance of £300 received on account of the trials, entered at low furnace, and then transferred by journal to the main works, where the debt of low furnace was rising in the same month by very nearly the same amount. "I can say what I entered and when I entered it," Miriam said. "I cannot say what any of it means about machines, and I will not be made to." Thomas gave his part narrowly and would give no more. In the spring of 1877, he had made up the control valve block for the lift, from figures written on a sheet in Ada's hand, not her father's, because he could tell the two hands apart and had said so at the time. Then he said one thing she made him repeat while she wrote it down. The first block he made had its two ports set out unequal, 1/8 of an inch off-center, because that was what the sheet gave him, and in the autumn she had brought him a corrected sheet, and he had opened the port out to the new figure. So the trials had worked, and the railway had paid £300, and all of it had been done at a yard that now stood on a schedule of debt with the words "no value" written beside the thing that made it work. That is the point where most people would have gone to a solicitor. Ada drained the pit again and got back to work, because the sale was still set for the 30th of April, and no paper was going to pay the coke merchant. The 8 weeks that followed were the hardest work of her life and the least dramatic. They patched the machine shop roof with 14 second-hand slates at 3 shillings the dozen and a strip of sheet zinc over the ridge. They cleaned 4 years of gum off the lathe and had a new belt made by a saddler on Savile Street for £1 4 shillings. Thomas went over the boiler with her, and they agreed to work it at 35 pounds to the inch and no more after a cold water test to 80, and she wrote that limit on a board and screwed the board to the wall where the firemen would see it. They lapped the valve seats and found the leaking one, with a groove in it you could feel with a thumbnail. They cleaned the accumulator guides and fitted 2 iron stops under the tub, so the hammer could not travel above 22 inches, whatever anybody did with a valve. They tested in steps, and Eli wrote the numbers and signed each page. By the 28th of March, they were forging. Charge the accumulator while the fire heated the blanks, shut the pump, then work the hammer off stored water for an hour, raising it to a measured height and letting it fall, and the falling was what did the forging. It ran better than it had in 1877, because the port that had been 1/8 of an inch out was now right. The first real order came through Nancy Gill's brother-in-law and was for track wedges. Then, on the 11th of April, Joseph Ellison came, 52, heavy and slow to speak. He had stood at the trials of 1877 without knowing until that morning that the works where they were held had been shut and put up for sale. He watched a test and measured the tools with his own gauges. Low furnace had made him 120 railway maintenance tools, track wedges, chisels, and spanners, everyone stamped LF1 and a number from 1 to 120, everyone entered in a book with its dimensions, the heat number of the bar, and the initials of whoever inspected it. He picked 11 at random and could not fault them. He paid 3 shillings and 6 each, £21 for the batch, and asked what she could do with a larger order if the works were still standing in the summer. 9 days later, Gideon Wycliffe came down the lane in a hired trap. He looked at the mended hearth and said it was good work, and he meant it, which was somehow worse. He offered £30 and the assumption of the whole schedule of debt to walk away before the sale. When she refused, he took out a second paper and said he was advised that the accumulator, its ram, weights, and crosshead, and the control valve were plant belonging to Wycliffe and Crane Engineering, portable equipment placed at low furnace for trial purposes, and that they would be removed. Then he showed her the third paper and watched her face while she read it. It was a copy of a provisional specification lodged at the Patent Office on the 21st of September, 1877, for improvements in the raising of drop hammers by stored hydraulic pressure in the name of Gideon Wycliffe of Sheffield, engineer. She read it twice, and the second time she was not angry because she had seen the drawing on the sheet. It showed the valve block with the 2 ports set out unequal, one of them 1/8 of an inch off-center. He had copied her, and he had copied her from the wrong year. The pressure came the following week, and it did not come from the law. The coke merchant, who had been letting her have 4 tons at a time on credit, sent word that deliveries would now be cash before tipping. The steel supplier in Attercliffe, who had known her father 20 years, took her order and sent it back unfilled. Nancy Gill told her a man from the main works had been round both yards, asking whether it was wise to be owed money by a place that would be sold in a fortnight. Then Thomas Bell stopped coming. He came himself on the Thursday and stood in the yard the way he had the first time. His son Robert, 24, was a fitter at the main works with a wife and a child of 8 months, and the foreman there had asked Robert twice on the Monday whether his father was mixed up in the trouble at Low Furnace. "I will not say a word that is not mine to say," Thomas said, "and I cannot come down here for a while." Ada said she understood, and she did. Then she wrote to the creditors clerk, to Joseph Ellison, and to Miriam, and asked all three of them something she had never asked anybody in her working life. She asked whether they would come and watch her do a thing and put their names to what they saw. The bailiff's man arrived on the 22nd of April. Frank Ormrod was 41 and had no view whatever on the ownership of anything. His instruction was that, while the plant was in dispute, the claimant might remove such items as were demonstrably portable on a receipt, and that anything fixed was to stay until the hearing. Ada asked for the rest of that day and used it. She, Miriam, and Eli went through the tower and the hammer bay from 10 in the morning until 8 at night and wrote down everything. Every bolt with its diameter and where it went. Every pipe with its bore and whether the joint had been made up in place. The guide rails, with the fixing centers and the depth of the pockets, cut into the brickwork for them. The ram, the base cylinder, the stone block bedded under it, and the maker's plate with the file marks at 2 corners. Ada drew the valve block full size, both faces. Every port measured twice, and took 2 lead squeezes of the port faces by driving sheet lead into them with a mallet. She and Miriam signed and dated the drawing and the paper the lead was wrapped in, and Eli signed under them both. Miriam wrote the inventory in her clerk's hand, 41 pages, and at the end, Ada added a line stating that the accumulator was part of a fixed installation and that taking the crosshead off before the load came off the ram would let the weights descend and rupture the buried line. Miriam copied that line into the letter book and pressed a copy. The contractor came at 11 the next morning with 6 men, 2 carts, and a set of chain blocks. The foreman was a hard, cheerful man called Sam Kettle, who had a written instruction in his pocket and no interest in anything else. Ada told him where to begin. The weights must come off the crosshead first, ring by ring, with the crane, and the ram be let down onto its bottom stop, with the discharge valve open. 3 hours, and nothing left behind that could fall. She told him twice, and the second time she said it in front of Ormrod and Miriam, who wrote down the hour. Kettle said his instruction was to take the crosshead, the ram cap, and the control valve first, because those were the pieces the master wanted. He got his blocks on the crosshead and knocked out the cotters holding it to the ram. The weights came down together. There was nothing dramatic about it for about half a second. The stack dropped onto its frame, the frame dropped onto the ram went down into its cylinder like a plunger into a syringe, and every gallon of water under it went out, the only way it could, into the 2-inch pipe. The elbow at the tower wall split and the water came through the brickwork in a sheet. The buried line let go under the flags, the hammer pit filled, and the pier at the corner of the bay moved about 4 inches and brought down the roof plate and 11 feet of wall, with Kettle under the edge of it to the knee. Ada did not go to Kettle first. She ran past him into the pump house and shut the upstream stop valve, because the tower was still delivering into a broken pipe. Then she got a bar under the roof plate with Eli and Ormrod, and they had Kettle out inside 2 minutes with a broken shin and a good deal to say. Nobody died. Eli, who had spent 2 months being told to write down every movement in that yard, stood at the gate with his book. Cart number 9, Hallam and Sons, carrier, away at 20 minutes past 3, carrying 1 crosshead, 1 ram cap, 6 lengths of pipe, and 1 valve block in a sack. He noted that a rolled drawing went onto the seat beside the driver. That drawing was the master drawing of the lift in Isaac Crane's hand and corrected in Ada's, and it never came back. She stood in the wreck of the bay that evening. The tower was open at its base, the hammer was blocked under a fallen roof plate, the iron that proved the geometry was on a cart, and the sale was in 7 days. What she had left was everything she had written down. She worked the case out on paper the way she would have worked out a job. The valve block was gone, but she had a full-size measured drawing of it and 2 lead squeezes of its ports, signed by 3 people the day before it went. The master drawing was gone, but her notebook carried the trial figures with their dates, and Gideon's specification of the 21st of September showed the uncorrected port. The accumulator was wrecked, but the guide pockets were still cut into the brickwork, and the buried pipe still lay in her trench. Miriam had the invoice, the accounts, and the press copies. Eli had a cart number. Ormrod had a signed receipt. On the 28th of April, Thomas Bell came down the lane with a folded paper. He had been given a copy of the instructions on the 22nd as the fitter who knew the system in case the contractor wanted advice. It directed that the crane control valve and the accumulator crosshead be removed from low furnace to the main works before the sale, and it was signed in ink, G. Wycliffe. His own hand calls it the crane valve, Thomas said. I will stand up and say I made it, and from whose figures, and nothing else at all. The hearing was held at low furnace on the 30th of April, in the machine shop, because the hammer bay was a ruin and it was raining. 19 people came. Mr. Naylor for the creditors, Mr. Silas Poole, the auctioneer with his bell and his book, Joseph Ellison for the railway company, the coke merchant, the steel supplier, 7 men who had worked at low furnace, Miriam, Thomas, and Eli, and Gideon Wycliffe with his solicitor, Mr. Rutherford. Ada had asked for 20 minutes. She had written the order of it out the night before and did not depart from it. She began with the creditor's own schedule and read the line aloud. Brick tower, narrow, east side of yard. Empty coal store. No value. Then she passed around Miriam's inventory book and walked them 12 feet to the tower door to look at the pockets cut into the brickwork for the guide rails, the stone foundation block, and the buried pipe lying open in the trench with its sockets made up hard against the shoulder. Mr. Naylor put his hand on the pipe himself. A thing built into a wall and buried under a floor is not portable, whatever a paper calls it. Then the maker's plate, with the file marks at the corners and the number LC47. Then Miriam's invoice from Latham and Cowper of Leeds, June 1876, £68, 10 shillings, job number LC47, delivered to Low Furnace, and the experimental account showing that Low Furnace money had paid for it. Then the press copies to Derby, and Ellison's own reply of the 4th of August, naming the pressure lift trials at Low Furnace and recording 19 inches and 11 blows to the minute. Ellison read it and said, in front of everybody, that he had written it. Then Ada's notebook, open flat, dated in her hand across 2 years, with the entry of the 29th of July that matched his letter figure for figure. Then Gideon's specification of the 21st of September, laid beside her sheet of the spring before, both showing the same valve and the same port an eighth of an inch off-center. Then Thomas Bell, who said about 30 words. He had made that valve block, from figures in Ada Crane's hand. He had set the ports unequal because the sheet said so, and had opened one out later when she brought him a corrected figure, and that corrected figure was in no paper of Mr. Wycliffe's. Then Miriam, who said only what she had entered and when. £300 received from the Midland Union Railway Company in October 1877 on account of the Low Furnace trials, entered at Low Furnace, transferred by journal to the main works 11 days later, with the debt of Low Furnace rising by £294 in the same month. Then Eli, 17 years old, who read a cart number and a time out of a boy's exercise book. Then Ada asked Mr. Rutherford whether his client denied that the control valve had been taken. Rutherford said his client had removed his own property. Ormrod read the removal receipt aloud. Then Thomas read the instruction he had been given on the 22nd, standing, slowly, because he read slowly. Remove the crane control valve and the accumulator crosshead to the main works before the sale. Signed, G. Wycliffe. Gideon was standing 8 feet from the hammer while it was read. He did not say anything. He looked at the fallen brickwork and then at the floor. After that, they went out into the wet and she showed them the thing worked. The accumulator was gone, so they pumped direct against a reduced load with 2/3 of the weights left off, holding 180 pounds to the inch on a gauge Ellison had brought and fitted himself. The bay was roped off and the iron stops were in, so the hammer could not rise above the approved height. Eli brought a blank out of the fire with the tongs and set it on the anvil. Ada worked the valve, and the hammer rose 11 inches and fell, and rose and fell 9 times, and one railway key came off the anvil and went into the water. Ellison measured it cold and said it was inside tolerance and better finished than the last lot he had bought from anybody. Mr. Naylor stopped the sale before Poole had rung his bell. The creditors could not properly sell property whose ownership and whose accounts stood in the state he had just been shown. He would apply for a receiver and manager, and the schedule would be corrected in the matter of the tower. The receiver's report took until August. It found that the railway advance of £300 had belonged to the low furnace project and had been wrongly applied at the main works, that fixed plant had been wrongfully removed and must be restored or paid for, and that Wycliffe and Crane Engineering owed low furnace £391. With that credit, the debt could be scheduled and paid rather than sold up. The Midland Union Railway Company suspended the disputed order at the main works and gave low furnace a supervised order of its own, 600 track wedges and chisels in 4 lots. The patent went on separately in offices in London and was not settled until 1881. 18 months later, in October of 1879, low furnace employed 9 people. The debt stood at £130 out of 406, paid quarterly and never late. Miriam Shaw kept the books at 26 shillings a week and hung the wage ledger open on a nail by the door where anybody could read what anybody earned, which 2 men objected to and then got used to. Thomas Bell was senior fitter at 34 shillings, with Robert working beside him. Eli Ward was a paid apprentice at 9 shillings a week, and his numbering book had become the works record book. Every drawing that left the loft carried the name of whoever drew it in the bottom right corner, which was not how it was done anywhere else in that valley. In June that year, Ada filed her improved safety control for hydraulic hammer lifts under her own name, out of works money, and the fees came to £25 and 11 shillings. The bay had been rebuilt with second-hand brick, and the crosshead and ram cap had come back on a cart in November. The valve block never came back, so Thomas and Ada made another from her drawing and the lead squeezes, with the ports right. On a Tuesday morning in October, Ada Crane stood at the control valve with the fire up, the pump shut off, and the stored water waiting under the weights. She was 32, and 2 years before she had been owed £22 and handed a dead yard instead of it, and of everything that yard had made since, the entry she checked first each morning was the one with the drawer's name in it. She read the gauge, 420 pounds to the inch. She let the hammer rise, checked the height against the mark, 16 inches, and held it there. Then she closed her father's brass dividers, the ones with the short point, and put them in her apron. "Enter the batch first," she said. "Number, bar, and who drew it." Eli wrote it in the book by the door, where the wages hung, where anybody who came into that yard could read the whole of it. When he had finished writing, he looked up, and she let the hammer fall.